Welcome to Social Work Week, everyone. And particularly welcome to this event, Practice Education in England, a national scoping review. We are really pleased that you are able to join us today, and we hope you have had and enjoyed and learned quite a lot throughout Social Work Week this year. I am Iona Roberts. I'm one of the regional engagement leads at Social Work England. And before I will hand it over to our main presenters today, I will go through a number of housekeeping slides. I have no doubt you become quite familiar by now with them. We also have an illustrator in this session, and the live illustration Chris is going to be sharing later on towards the end of the session, hopefully some illustration with us. Now, we have a legal disclaimer, and I'm going to say that probably you have seen in all our previous sessions, but any views, information or opinions expressed by third party during Social Work Week are the speaker's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Social Work England or its employees. Social Work England has not endorsed third party content, and Social Work England does not accept any liability for the content of third party or other sector-led sessions throughout the week. In terms of privacy notice, there is absolute no surprise to you that your privacy is really important to us. Therefore, we know that you have shared your email addresses and your name. Please be ensured that once as you have agreed to contact you for the purpose of this event, and we're going to use your information just for the purpose of event management and evaluation, you're going to see towards the end of the session that my colleagues are going to post in the chat evaluation form, a feedback form, and a survey. Do feel free to share your views and feedback about the session. We're going to use your information in accordance with our data retention schedule. This is available on our website, and we are going to retain the information maximum up to 3 years as per our schedule. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our main speakers. And this is the first one to come online is Rebecca Mulvaney, Policy Manager at Social Work England. We also have Dr. Lara Cook from University of East Anglia, Dr. Mark Gregory from University of East Anglia, and Lara Teams, Head of Education Programs at Social Work England. For Rebecca, now back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lara, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really exciting that we're able to launch this research. So as part of this session, you're going to get an overview of the findings of the research from Mark and Lara. And the research has been published on our website as of yesterday, I'm really pleased to say. So at the end of the session, we'll pop a link to the full research report and a summary of the research that Social Work England has provided in the chat in case you want to go and have a read of it yourselves. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes at the start to set the scene and provide a little bit of context for Social Work England's interest in practice education and our role in the quality assurance of social work education and training. I'm sure that some of you in the audience today, this is an area that you're probably already familiar with because you might be here from an education provider, you might be a social work student, or you may well be a practice educator yourself. So I'll keep this quick because I'm sure that the findings of the research is the bit that we're all really interested in. But it's probably worth reflecting that at Social Work England, we have a very clear understanding that practice educators play a crucial role in public protection, acting as almost gatekeepers to the profession due to their role in social work education and training courses, their supervision of social work students on placement, their assessment, and the support and guidance that they provide to students as they work through their experience of practice-based learning. And we also recognise that practice educators are, within their roles, assessing a student's competence and their suitability to progress within that initial education and training space. Currently, the only direct relationship that Social Work England has with practice educators is through our education and training standards. So we don't register practice educators as a distinct group. We don't annotate the role of practice education, which we do for a couple of other specialisms, such as for approved mental health professionals. And we don't set standards for practice educators. It's all done through the education and training standards. But we do meet with practice educators through our course approval, inspection and monitoring processes. We do have practice educators represented on our National Advisory Forum and on our Education and Training Advisory Forum. And we have commissioned research into both practice education specifically, which we're here to talk about today, and previously into sort of education in general, in which we did speak to practice educators. And that's kind of that sort of research that we commissioned previously is kind of built into our rationale for commissioning this specific piece of research now that goes into a little bit more detail around practice education specifically. And we also have practice educators within our staff teams and our partner roles. So that includes our education and quality assurance inspectors. There's some practice educators represented in that group too. I just wanted to touch very briefly on the education and training standards, which I've mentioned. So these were launched in September 2021. And since September 2021, we've been embarking on a huge programme of activity, inspecting and reapproving every social work course in England. So that's 80 distinct course providers and 308 courses, which is quite a big job, as you can imagine. And that programme of work has been taking place over 3 years and is due to conclude towards the end of this year. We're hoping that we're going to be able to take a huge amount of learning from that process. And as part of that process, we have engaged with practice educators in every single one of those inspections. But those new standards did bring in some changes into the social work education space. A very notable change was our requirement that all social work students now have to spend a minimum of 200 days in practice-based learning, which was not a sort of strict requirement before we introduced these new standards, and at least one placement in a statutory setting involving statutory tasks. So that's been quite a big change, and something that intersects obviously with the availability of practice placements and the role of the practice educator. And just to touch very briefly on the standards that sort of directly address practice educators, we have standard 2.6, which ensures that practice educators are registered with Social Work England. Again, that was a sort of a little bit more of an enhanced requirement, and that they have relevant current knowledge, skills and experience. So as part of our inspection process, when we meet with practice educators, we speak to them about the support that they get from their employers, but also the support that they get from education providers as well, the training that they've undertaken, and the sort of ongoing refresher training that they might be engaging with. We also have standard 3.8, which relates to the sort of adequate staffing of social work courses, and that is also of interest to us in terms of practice education and the kind of like the work that education providers and placement providers do collaboratively to make sure that there are enough practice educators in place. And there's also standards that don't speak explicitly to practice educators, but in the guidance on those standards, it does sort of relate to the role of the practice educator, particularly around sort of student assessment, practice-based learning and student support as well as sort of the ongoing monitoring of students' conduct, character and health, which the practice educator is a huge information point for during placement. So there's a little bit of a taster of where we already have a relationship with practice educators, but part of the reason why we commission this research is because over the next few years, we want to see how we can enhance and potentially widen that relationship. And it's probably worth saying as well that we currently have education and training standards, as I've mentioned, for qualifying social work courses, but we don't have standards for the courses that practice educators undertake themselves. And we don't regulate the education of practice educators, which is another area that we might have a look at developing further in the future. But I will now hand over to Mark and Laura to talk about the findings from the research, and I hope that you find it very interesting. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's absolutely lovely to be here to talk about this project. I want to begin by introducing and acknowledging the work of the team on this project, in particular the work of Thomas Butt, our research associate on the project, our research intern, Joanna Shakespeare, and our many colleagues at Research in Practice, without whom it wouldn't have been possible to complete a national review in 4.5 months. So our review of practice education in England was carried out last summer between late May and August 2023, and it consisted of 4 key work streams. So the first was a review of the existing literature, looking at the existing evidence base for practice education. The second was a desktop review of placement handbooks, looking at the current models of supervision, the assessment of practice learning in use by qualifying social work programmes across England. The third was a survey of local authorities aiming to establish the demographics and numbers of practice educators in England. And finally, we held a national consultation with practice educators across adults and children's services in England. This consisted primarily of 4 large-scale focus groups, which were attended by 127 practice educators. And we also carried out an additional 28 in-depth individual interviews with social workers. In addition to this, we spoke to course providers and placement providers to gain their views of practice learning and education. So today we'll be focusing on the findings from the research with a real focus on the qualitative findings. We'll also touch on quite an unexpected and important finding, which was the close relationship between the practice education system and recruitment and retention in England. A link to this will appear in the chat, but you can access the full report and all the details of the work streams in the report, which is now live on the Social Work England website. And as I'm working through the sections of the report today, the findings today, do feel free, as Joanna said, to use the Q&A function at the top of your screen to ask us any questions that come to mind. Okay, over to Mark to discuss workstream 1.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Laura. So yes, I led on the first 2 work streams of the project, so I'm going to talk you through those a little bit now. So the aim of the literature review that we undertook was to explore the views and experiences of the practice educator workforce from the existing literature, and also looking at the views of other relevant stakeholders such as students, placement providers and course providers. And the focus of the included studies had to be on practice learning and assessment in the UK in particular. That was our focus. The articles that we identified generally tended to focus on a particular area of practice education, for example, working with students at risk of not passing placement, or identifying the skills that practice educators needed to support social work students in developing, the impact of professional or regulatory changes on practice education, and finally things like enablers and barriers experienced by practice educators within their role. Ultimately, we identified 38 studies for inclusion, and we analysed these thematically, and we identified 4 broad thematic categories, which were working with students, relationships and emotional labour, the practice education system, and the wider context of practice education. What we found from the existing literature was that there were some weaknesses in the existing evidence base. So we found that there were no real large-scale national studies of practice education. Most studies were quite localised and often drew on the researchers' existing networks. And that was one of the things that we were hoping to address with this national scoping review. We found also that many of the studies were small scale, some very small scale, so kind of fewer than 10 participants in the studies. And there were only 3 studies that we identified that had more than 50 participants. And what we found was that much of the research was not necessarily as rigorous as it could be. So much of the research didn't identify clear research questions that they were seeking to answer, or provide detailed accounts of how data were analysed. And what we found was that 2 of the largest studies, those with over 50 participants, were based on workshop discussions, and those workshops weren't actually recorded and transcribed. So there was some question marks over how well those discussions were actually preserved for analysis. One thing that we found was that whilst the voices of practice educators as a general population were quite well represented within the literature, so there was good evidence that practice educators had been consulted within the existing research literature, there was a real lack of research looking specifically at the experiences of practice educators from minoritised groups, and particularly those from global majority backgrounds and those who may have a disability or issues of neurodiversity. And again, that was something that we were seeking to address within the research that we were undertaking. A key finding from the review in the literature was just how striking it was that the practice educators are expected to engage in a really wide range of relationships, and managing those relationships is quite a complex task for practice educators to have to navigate. So as well as supporting the students directly and those students having their own kind of diverse needs, practice educators also have to work with colleagues within their organisations, or they have to work with on-site supervisors if they're a long arm or off-site practice educator, and they also have to work closely with course providers as well. And building and maintaining that positive network of relationships around the student was one of the things that was coming through in the research as being crucial to the success of placements. But those different stakeholders that are involved in making a placement successful all have quite different requirements from placement and quite different expectations. So managing those relationships can be quite challenging work for practice educators. Another thing that we found was that practice education, much like social work practice in general, means that it involves emotional labour. And emotional labour is where individuals work in situations that require them to manage or mask their kind of normal emotional responses to what's going on around them so that they can carry out the functions that are expected of them as a professional. And for practice educators, this emotional labour was most apparent when they were working with students who were at risk of not passing placement. So what we found was that for a lot of practice educators, they found that the experience of managing students who might not pass placement led to them experiencing really challenging emotions, things like anger, self-blame and guilt. And within the studies, what we noted was that this caused some practice educators to report feeling very isolated in their role. And in some cases, practice educators were reporting that managing a failing student had led to them considering leaving their role as practice educator entirely. More positively, practice educators did identify that colleagues played a really important part in enabling them to share their feelings. Teams offered them real kind of significant support, and ultimately that helped them to feel able to remain in their role as practice educators. Another key finding was how the complexity of social work practice generally adds to the complexity of the practice educator role. So one of the things that came through strongly in the research was that changes to regulation of social work and the introduction of new frameworks for assessment of practice learning, such as the professional capabilities framework, had all had an impact on the work of practice educators. And more broadly, practice educators within the existing literature reported that they felt they often operated at the intersection of competing conceptions of what social work is as a profession. So practice educators work closely with or work within organisations, so they're exposed to some of the more procedural and more bureaucratic aspects of practice. But they also work closely with course providers who promote social work as very much a value and evidence-based profession. And for some practice educators, this created additional complexity for them within their role. So the second work stream that I led on was looking at how practice learning and assessment is actually delivered in practice. So for this work stream, we were looking to establish what the existing models look like, looking at qualifying social work course providers across England. And this work consisted of a desktop analysis of placement handbooks from 23 providers, and that included 2 fast track qualifying routes, as well as BA routes, MA routes, and some apprenticeship routes as well. And that sample represented around 28% of the providers in England. And one of the things that we found in looking at those different placement handbooks was actually there were lots of areas of similarity between how practice learning was delivered. So all placements had the same basic structure. So there was a level 1 placement of 70 days, a level 2 placement of 100 days, and 30 skill days being provided across the remainder of the programme. And as Rebecca touched on, a lot of that is down to the work that Social Work England have done in standardising the recommendations for practice learning on social work degree programmes. And this was the case for fast-track qualifying routes as well as traditional university routes. Though fast-track placements were generally condensed over a much shorter period, usually of around 14 months or so. Another similarity was that all of the course providers used both the Professional Capabilities Framework and Social Work England standards as frameworks for assessing students on placement, and one of the providers also used the knowledge and skills statements as an additional framework for assessing student learning. There were some areas of variation as well that we uncovered. So there was particular variation around evidence requirements for placement portfolios, and in particular, how responsible students were for collating large amounts of evidence to support the recommendation for them to pass their placement, or whether there was much more emphasis placed on the holistic judgment of the practice educator. So that actually varied quite a lot between different providers. Another area of variation that we identified was the use of practice educators who were PEPS 1 or PEPS 2 qualified. For those of you that don't know the PEPS, it's the Practice Educator Professional Standards, and there are 2 levels of them. So only PEPS 2 qualified practice educators are able to independently assess learners on their second practice placement. So some course providers only use those who are up to PEPS 2 level of qualification, whereas some providers used practice educators who were PEPS 1 qualified as well. Another area of variation that we noted was that there was variation in the number of days in from placement that providers offered, and this ranged from as few as 3 days in from placement across the entire placement to as many as 25 days in. So really significant variation there. And a lot of that was down to how the providers were using those 30 skills days. So that seemed to kind of really contribute to that variation. We did also identify some areas of innovation that could potentially be rolled out more widely and might help to address some of the challenges that we found within the literature and within our own research on practice education in England. For instance, one of the things that we found was that one of the fast track programs use a unit model for practice education, where one practice educator will have a small group of students that they provide group supervision to, and that model could be useful where course and placement providers are struggling with sufficiency of practice educators. So we're not having enough practice educators to deliver a one-to-one model of practice education. One provider also explicitly encouraged the use of the Mandela model in supervision between practice educators and students to try and encourage greater discussion of identity, particularly for students or practice educators who were from minoritized backgrounds. And given some of the findings that Laura's about to discuss, more encouragement for people to explore issues of identity in that practice educator and student relationship could well be beneficial. I'm now going to hand over to Laura, who's going to talk through the qualitative findings from our consultation.
Thanks, Mark. So as part of the project, we had the very great pleasure of speaking to 127 practice educators across 4 focus groups. And we spoke to both independent practice educators and practice educators employed within organisations. And we wanted to find out why they wanted to become practice educators, as well as what sustained them in their role as a practice educator. As a research team, we were really struck by the clear passion and pride among the social workers we talked to about practice education. And we had quite an unusual problem for a research team in that at one point we actually had to turn participants away. We had too many. Many people wanted to talk to us about practice education, and it was a very important part of their social work identity. So across all of the practice educators we spoke to, there were 3 key motivations for becoming a practice educator: generative, formative, and reparative. These reasons for becoming a practice educator also acted as an important ongoing source of motivation, sustaining practice educators in their role in the long term. And what was interesting is that these factors, and indeed the role of being a practice educator, often sustained social workers within the profession itself. So a real link between retention and becoming a practice educator. So we'll look at each of these in turn. So generative first. So many participants were strongly motivated to become a practice educator due to their passion for the profession and their desire to shape it by supporting the next generation of social workers coming through. So participants' motivations for becoming a practice educator have much in common with Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. So Erikson argued that The key to finding ongoing meaning in midlife is through generativity, through the nurture of things that will outlast us in some way, whether this is mentoring or parenting, and this is crucial to avoid a sense of stagnation. Similarly, practice education acted as a really powerful source of generativity for many social workers, particularly those in the mid and later stages of their career. Becoming a practice educator very often helped them to stay motivated, find ongoing meaning in their work, and in many cases, it was a key factor that sustained them in the profession. Practice educators describe supporting, nurturing, raising the next generation of social workers, and the very real pleasure of observing students' development from novice to social worker. And I was struck by one particular practice educator who mentioned seeing one of her previous students become a social worker and then going on to have students of her own. And she said they're almost my grand students. So really a really important influence that they could exert on the profession. Passing on their wisdom to social workers of the future was a way to maximise their impact on a profession they were proud to be a part of. And it also involved upholding professional standards. So practice educators regarded themselves as having an important gatekeeping role. And that word gatekeeper came up again and again in our workshop with practice educators. Part of the role was ensuring that only students with the skills, values that were necessary were able to qualify and work with some of our most vulnerable service users. Practice educators viewed their work with students as key to embedding skills and knowledge, and this came with a real sense of responsibility as well as enjoyment. Practice education also offered a very powerful source of ongoing personal and professional development for practice educators. So for many, becoming a PE was a powerful formative experience. They made frequent reference to practice education as a reciprocal learning process, so mutual learning between the student and the practice educator. And also as a practice educator, the idea was for many that we spoke to that you continue to learn about yourself on an ongoing basis. Many participants identified that becoming a PE helped them to keep their knowledge up to date, and others commented that it was a real antidote to becoming disengaged with practice, particularly over the course of a very long career. For others, it was a respite from casework. We know that within social work, there are often a lack of opportunities for progression for social workers who don't wish to pursue a management route. And what was interesting about practice education was that it was often a way for social workers who didn't wish to go into management to gain an ongoing sense of professional development, purpose, and ongoing meaning. And finally, there was a reparative motivation for many practice educators who entered the role to address a prior personal negative experience of practice education, or as some described it, to right a wrong in the profession. Many were motivated to provide better support for students than they themselves had received as a student. And this was a powerful motivator for them to do the practice education role justice. You can see from the quotation there, one practice educator talked about having a chaotic nightmare practice educator and thinking, I don't want anybody else to ever have that same experience that I did. Practice educators were also motivated to address the real issue with retention and recruitment within the profession. So nurturing student social workers within their local authority was an important way to secure high quality permanent workers within teams which were often struggling to fill vacancies. So as one practice educator described, becoming a practice educator, I have the opportunity within my team to grow my own. Another said, I am building a team who will work with me in the future. And they made a strong link between good placements, which lead to good social workers joining the team, and then good retention. So practice education was important in a number of ways, but primarily it related to and helped to address some of these issues that are very familiar to us around retention and recruitment. So firstly, it appeared that becoming a practice educator offered opportunities for generativity, reparative and formative experiences that help to sustain and retain social workers in the profession. But also crucially, practice education acted as a vital pipeline for the recruitment of newly qualified social workers within local authorities. So lots of important positive things about being a practice educator, but also there were some challenges around the role. So firstly, practice emphasises, coherent with what Mark identified in the literature, there was a lot of emotional labour involved in practice education. It involved typically developing a very close relationship with students, teaching someone how to be a social worker. It involved touching on personal aspects such as how you present yourself, how you dress, mental health, issues in their personal life that could be coming and affecting their work with service users. So emotional labour was particularly significant for many practice educators. This was amplified when practice educators were working with students who were at risk of failing their placements. So this was very difficult. One practice educator particularly recalled a vivid moment in her work with a student where a student said to her, "If I fail this placement, it's going to ruin my life." And she spoke of the weight of the damage and the emotional weight and the responsibility of supporting a student through that. There was a very delicate balance to be struck between keeping the students' confidence up, being supportive and nurturing, but also being sufficiently challenging, enabling students who were at risk of failing their placement to make the required changes to their practice. And having a student who ultimately went on to fail their placement could be a really difficult, demotivating experience for a practice educator. There was a real risk in terms of retaining practice educators if their first experience of having a student involved a placement fail. In that case, they could feel very motivated to step away from the role. In these situations, the support from the students' course provider and more crucially the social workers, the practice education team, made the difference and sometimes appeared to encourage practice educators to stay. What was really interesting was that social workers also identified a real increase in the number of students and practitioners with a late diagnosis of dyslexia, ASD, ADHD, or other forms of neurodivergence. And in some cases, it was the practice educator themselves who identified an issue, sparking a diagnosis, which they then went on that journey with their student to support them. So there was a real consensus amongst the practice educators we spoke to that working with neurodivergence was a really important and increasingly prevalent aspect of their work, but it wasn't necessarily a component of their practice educator training. For practice educators, the organisational context was absolutely key. So workloads could make it difficult, particularly where the emotional labour of the role was not recognised by their team or their manager. This could make it difficult for them to find sufficient time to do the role justice. And the practice educators team could really make or break the success of the placement. So one practice educator said, "It's the team that makes the difference. If the team has a student rather than the practice educator, that makes the placement go smoothly." Another challenge identified by practice educators was the real inconsistency and variation in student assessment across different universities, higher education providers. And they identified that this was a real issue when they had students from a number of different courses because they had to spend a lot of time familiarising themselves with very different models and modes of assessment. Practice educators identified an issue with inconsistency around payment, and this was hugely variable across different local authorities, across different organisations. And they were concerned that the rate was insufficient given the expertise, responsibility, and that emotional labour involved in the role. Finally, practice educators noted limited development opportunities in terms of CPD for that practice educator role. They were really keen to receive more feedback from course providers on how they had done with a student to boost their development and to inform their future practice. And I'll touch on some of the main recommendations from practice educators in a moment. As part of the research, we also spoke to 28 Black and Global Majority practice educators undertaking detailed, in-depth individual interviews. We know from previous research that there are limitations to the progression of Black and Global Majority social workers, especially in terms of access to leadership roles, which is why we wanted to have this as an area of focus within the research. So they identified a real problem with underrepresentation of Black and global majority workers in the PE workforce more generally. And they also reported additional barriers to becoming a practice educator. It was really interesting to note that some local authority leads, when we spoke to local authorities, they spoke of wanting people to put themselves forward to be a practice educator, not necessarily advertising it, because their view was that we want people to come forward who are genuinely motivated to be PEs, who want to support students. They aren't just doing it for the progression. However, this lack of transparency from talking to Black and global majority practice educators, it really seemed to disproportionately disadvantage Black social workers, who said that they simply very often did not have the information that they needed in order to embark on the training or know more about taking on the role. So it was often the support of one very good manager who championed them and put them forward, that rather than their organisation as a whole, that made that available. And they also emphasised a greater emphasis on Black perspectives within the practice educator training. So there were 6 key recommendations from social workers in relation to practice education as a whole. So firstly, they indicated they would welcome registration and regulation. There was real support for annotation of the practice educator role in line with the approved mental health practitioners and best interest assessor roles. It was generally felt that this would lead to greater recognition and would lead in turn to greater opportunities and access to CPD and workload relief. As I touched on, they were keen for the prospect of standardisation of payments to practice educators to overcome that existing inconsistency. They also indicated they would welcome greater standardisation of placement paperwork, but it should be noted, as we'll come on to discuss, that this was something that was not a view that was not shared by course providers. They indicated that changes to the PE qualification would be helpful, including training and CPD. They welcomed greater progression opportunities, particularly clear, defined routes for career progression within the practice educator role, including potential opportunities for experience status within that role, and also more equitable routes into practice education, particularly for Black and global majority social workers. And they were also very keen to support the idea that there should be a mandated workload relief for the role to sustain practice educators in their role. So I just want to touch briefly on the views of placement providers now. So this was local authorities, organisations who host student placements, and we conducted a small focus group to capture some of these views. So 13 professionals attended the group. We had 10 from local authorities, somebody from CAFCAS, representing teaching partnerships too, and all participants had responsibility for the coordination of student placements within their organisation. So placement providers offered a range of different workshops, peer support and training for practice educators. What was notable was this provision was very different across the different placement providers and organisations, completely different strategies. So they also indicated that, of course, they were working within the context of very straitened circumstances, and this could mean that they weren't as able to support particularly neurodivergent students with appropriate software and so on in the way that they would like. What was significant that in terms of tracking and supporting practice educators within their organisations, there were a whole range of different approaches. What typically appeared to be the case is that knowledge of the PEs available, whether they had space for a student, who they were, where they were, came down to the knowledge of one individual who had that specialist local knowledge. And this explains why in our survey, we weren't able to accurately capture how many the practice educators were in each local authority and so on, because though that local knowledge was typically held by one person, and it was a different person within each organisation who didn't necessarily have it as a named part of their role. Most placement providers emphasised again that registration annotation of the practice educator role would be useful, so they supported that. Over to you, Mark.
Lovely, thanks, Laura. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and go through this reasonably quickly to leave time for Q&A. So, yeah, we also consulted with representatives of course providers. We had representation from 9 universities, and all of the individuals that were involved in the focus group that we undertook were directly involved in the provision of student placements. One of the issues that came up in the focus group was around placement sufficiency. So a lot of the universities reported that they simply didn't have enough quality placements to provide their students, and what that meant was that they'd had to move from a process of matching students to a placement to allocating placements to students, and that meant some of that important work around ensuring there was a good fit between the student, the placement and the practice educator wasn't always being done. It's important to note that view wasn't unanimous. We did have people within the group who said that they were still very heavily involved in matching and that was quite a lengthy, in-depth process, but that was an issue that came up within the focus group. One of the things that was also a key theme was this perceived variability in the quality of both placements and practice educators. So there was real variability in the experiences that students had and the learning opportunities that were available to them. Some of that was down to the style of the practice educator or their level of experience, their level of capability. Some of it was down to the busyness of the social work teams that students were being placed in and their ability to properly support a student. But that did mean that there was quite inconsistent experiences. And whilst the course providers felt that they had quite a lot of control over teaching within the classroom setting, that wasn't the case when students were out on placement. And this meant they felt there was a certain inevitability about students having slightly inconsistent experiences in practice learning. Some course providers also reported feeling quite powerless in addressing issues with practice educators, particularly when those practice educators were employed by local authorities. So course providers felt that with independent practice educators who they had a contract with, it was slightly easier to address issues with their practice. However, when they were working in organisations, they found it was much more challenging to be able to really kind of confront some of those issues around poor practice. In general, the course providers agreed with a lot of the recommendations of practice educators and placement providers around what was needed for practice education. So in particular, they felt there needed to be greater recognition for practice educators and recognition that they were undertaking a really difficult, challenging, complex role in what are particularly challenging practice circumstances at the moment. And they felt that that recognition should include improved remuneration, has been mentioned, so more fair pay for practice educators, but also genuine protected workload relief and an improved CPD offer as well. And as Laura touched on, the one real area of disagreement from the course providers was that they had some reservations about standardisation of things like assessment of students, so the paperwork that was being used, because they were worried that we might end up with a messy amalgamation of all of the different bits of current models, and they were also worried about the ability to then respond to local variations and local needs if there was too much standardisation. There was, however, one strong dissenting voice in the focus group who felt that those concerns were outweighed by the benefits of having greater standardisation.
Okay, to conclude then, so a SWOT analysis of practice education. So I think a real strength that came through was the passion and the commitment of many highly experienced and very highly motivated practice educators. I think, as Rebecca touched on, the lack of national oversight and the localised nature of practice education systems, there is a risk there that created significant variability in the provision of practice education, and that seemed to be the case for from the perspective of the practice educators that we spoke to. In terms of opportunities, I think there's great appetite and enthusiasm for change and revisiting the practice education system, both in terms of standardisation, regulation, annotation, and so on. And I think also threats. So there is an issue, the practice education workforce, it is somewhat precarious in the sense that there are a number of internal and external factors, particularly around the broader context of retention and recruitment and increased caseloads too. So that's all from us. So we're going to now move to Q&A, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Mark. I believe, Lara, do you want to come in before Q&A?
Sorry, we've just got a couple of slides before we head into the Q&A section now.
Absolutely.
So if you just bear with me. So it was really great to hear from Mark and Laura there. I know that we've all been really excited about seeing this research out there and for practice educators and course providers and employers to look at as well. It's the first time we've had such like a comprehensive piece of work around practice education. So really, with that in mind, we need to think about kind of what are the next steps now and what are we thinking here at Social Work England based on that research. And I think, you know, it's suffice to say that we are really pleased to have this body of evidence to look at, and we want to really start to build on that and really look at, well, what are those different models of practice education, really get to grips with the courses that are providing practice education courses, speak to employers, and really start to get a grip of, you know, what's working really well and what needs to happen next. So really thinking about that potential regulation of social workers who take on the practice education role. So we're continuing to share this research that we've commissioned, and the research is now publicly available, and we'll drop a link into the chat at the end of this session so that everybody can go away and read that if you haven't had a chance to kind of go into the depth and look at it. It's quite a lot longer than some of the information that you've seen here. This really is a higher level synopsis of that really great piece of work. We're continuing to engage with stakeholders that have an interest in funding, sufficiency and quality of practice education, and those partners include Department for Education, Department of Health and Social Care, Apprenticeship Trailblazer Group and the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. So really thinking about all of those key stakeholders that are involved with practice educators and that initial learning space for our future workforce. And we plan to continue to build on the inspection cycle that we have had in the last 2 years. We're in our final year of inspection, as Rebecca said, for those initial training courses for social work, and as part of that, no doubt we'll be able to pick out some of those emerging themes as well about practice education, which will further enrich the information that we've got from this research. And as I made a note to earlier, really thinking about, you know, what might the future of regulation look like in this practice education space. We've spoken really about the real value of practice education, and you know, we've made reference throughout the research to that gatekeeping role of the practice educator and the levels of kind of standards around practice education. So with that in mind, and thinking about our role as a regulator and the integral role of practice education, an exploration of regulation is one to be considered. So with that, you know, what might these options look like? And there are a number of options that we could look at in relation to the regulation of practice education. And some of these options, you know, in terms of our inspection activity and our regulation work, it is shaped by the rules, regulations and legislation. So we may need to think about whether or not there is a need to look at those rules and regulations. But as always, we need to make a decision about whether or not that is proportionate, and thinking about the risk and what is in the public interest at this point. So, as I said, some of these options could include annotation of the register. So we've got that kind of clear picture and we know who the practice educators are, because at the moment there isn't that really comprehensive oversight of the practice education workforce. There may be scope for additional standards for practice educators, new education training standards for courses that train practice educators, really thinking about continuing professional development requirements for practice educators. We know that social workers already complete CPD, but is there something more specialist there in terms of supporting practice educators to think about what their individual learning needs are in development spaces? Also thinking about you know, how we reflect that within our education training standards for qualifying courses, and thinking about guidance for course providers. Any new proposals that we kind of move forward in this space with would obviously be open to full public consultation and would not come into effect until the end of our reapproval cycle. This really is just a space to start to explore and to think about what the future of practice education may look like using this research as a rich base. And we will now move on to an opportunity for all of you that have patiently been sitting there with your burning questions, and we'll get some questions over to Laura and Mark.
I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you, Lara. And I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm mindful. I think we are very ambitious as a group, isn't it? We hope to. It's a huge research to cover. Absolutely, and really key teams coming through. Right, we do have lots of questions, and I'm going to say we are already mindful that we might not be able to fully cover all of those questions you have kindly put in the Q&A. First one, I'm not going to lose any time. What are the main areas you will have wanted to explore further if you have had a little bit more time in terms of the research? And I'm going to open the floor to anybody who will come forward to respond to this. I presume Laura.
I could maybe comment very quickly from Social Work England's perspective and then pass over to Laura. We asked the research team to do a huge amount of work given the time that we gave them for this initial research study, and I think that there were lots of areas that if we'd had the resource and the time, we would like to explore further. We're quite interested in the persistent issue of not really being able to get a full sense of the practice educator workforce, and that's something that we're thinking about how Social Work England could tackle that persistent and tricky question going forwards. We also would be quite interested in having a bit of a closer look at the courses that train practice educators, so that's something that we might look at exploring further this year. But you know, there would have been so much that we could have gone into and looked at, you know, getting right into the detail of that practice educator student relationship, getting into the detail of different models of practice education and how that maybe even looks internationally was something that we talked about at one point, not just within the sort of English context. And yeah, there could be so much. So this is a high level piece of research. The team did a great job to get as much into it as they could, but as they reflected describing the findings of the literature review, we are also encouraging everyone out there with an interest in practice education to think about how education providers and practitioners can maybe add to the pool of research, because there's still so much that we don't know and that we would like to explore further. Laura and Mark.
Yes, I think I'll add to that, Rebecca. I would agree. All of those things are really important. Particularly, it would be very interesting to do some international comparative work and look at different systems of practice education, because I think there's the opportunity for kind of great knowledge sharing there in terms of social work in other countries. I would add that one thing we didn't touch on in the presentation, but was a feature of our interviews with social workers and our workshops, was the issue of practice educators with disabilities and practice educators with neurodivergence, often themselves supporting students with neurodivergence as well. And that is something that we weren't expecting to hear about, but was really significant to a number of the practice educators and how they were supported in their role with that. I also think it would be very useful to conduct further qualitative research to look at the trajectories of practice educators through their career as a practice educator, because it would appear that there are some key moments of vulnerability, such as the first time that the practice educator works with a student who fails their placement, and that can be a real push factor. So identifying those moments, those key moments where maybe practice educators are more vulnerable to step away from their role, and what we can do to support them to continue, because we know practice education is so important. So yes, lots of things that we would love to do.
Thank you. I'm going to come in with lots of other questions, so as much we can squeeze before 2 o'clock. I'm mindful of the time. Was there any discussion with people who live experiences and how of social work, I'm assuming, and how they have felt working with the student social worker and practice educator?
Not as part of this research project. I think that there is, because we primarily focused on practice educators themselves, but I think there really is a complementary piece of work to be done here in 2 other areas. So firstly, involving people with lived experience, but also with social work students as well and their experiences of practice education. So I think that there are further projects, and that would absolutely be part of a further project. I don't know, Mark, if you wanted to sort of add anything to that.
I think I was just going to kind of say, you know, that would be a really interesting piece of research, but kind of outside of the scope of what we were able to do in the time that we had. As Rebecca mentioned, we already had quite a big remit to kind of cover within the time, so that wasn't possible to do alongside what we did.
Can I also share with you all that we do have a number of proposed collaboration in the Q&A. I promise you all that we are going to mention to all our speakers today. I have seen National Association of Practice Educators, who are, one of the questions is, were they involved in this research? Can they be involved going forward? But equally from BASWA colleagues as well, please be reassured. I'm going to communicate that with my colleagues from Social Work England, but also UEA, University of East Anglia. A final question, and then I'm going to bring Chris in, our illustrator, who has been very patient waiting for us to finalize. What can be done through regulation to ensure all social work employers allow a minimum number of social workers trained as practice educator to help all fulfill social workers' role in maintaining and developing the profession? Therefore, I guess this is for Lara and Rebecca. What can they do through regulation to ensure all social employers will allow a minimum number of social workers trained as practice educators to help fulfill social workers' role and maintain and developing the profession?
I think that's in terms of the minimum numbers, we really need to understand what the landscape already looks like. I think there are lots of practice educators out there. Are we utilising all of the practice educators that are there? You know, how many practice educators have got currency? You know, is there, you know, additional training that could be offered to bring them out of sort of, you know, waiting in the wings and bring them back into practice education? So I think before we start to look at, well, what is the additional need, let's understand what we currently have, and then I think it is really about really emphasising the importance of practice education and getting you know, employers to understand, you know, the crucial role that practice educators you know, provide in terms of growing the workforce. Many employers do, but really thinking about in that busyness of kind of the day-to-day work, what support practice educators might need in order to stay within that role as well.
Great, thank you everyone. And once again, we are really sorry we cannot cover all the questions you have posted very kindly in the Q&A section. I'm going now to bring Chris, if that is okay, on the screen and remove including myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Iona.
Please,
I'm just going. Can you hear me?
Please come in. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So if this conversation was a high-level version of the research, then you can all consider this illustration the next level up. So maybe think of this as like a contents page for the research, and then you can sort of dive in even deeper if you want to. So in terms of the background, I think it was really key that we pulled out that practice educators are crucial to this process, and I consider them the gatekeepers to the profession. So they provide guidance and oversight for the students, and at the minute, Social Work England engages with educators via their training standards. So if we could dive into the research a little bit, we've got the literature review side. So from the literature review, some of the things that were pulled out were challenges of managing all these complex relationships, challenges, but also the benefits as well of being involved in a wide team. Then we've got the emotional labour, and it's often unseen emotional labour of managing failing students, and this sort of like leads to demotivation in the workforce. And then maybe a benefit, maybe some more opportunity to explore issues of identity between students and educators. And then the educator view, they express the value of nurturing the next generation, being able to pass on everything they've learned and keep the profession going in a way. And the personal development that comes from working with their students. So they learn from their students, but also students learn from them as the teachers. Some of them might take a more personal approach, and they're trying to repair a poor personal experience that they've had themselves by doing it better this time. And then one of the things that was pulled out was this sort of like underrepresentation of the global majority in the workforce. And that kind of leads on to some of the recommendations about regulation, fair remuneration or fairer pay, more consistent pay across the board, training and CPD, clearer progression through the workforce. So is there a way that they can be recognised for their experience through their titles? And then further routes in, including, most importantly, the underrepresentation.
Thank you.
And then in terms of what,
Thank
sorry,
you.
that's probably enough, isn't it?
I'm mindful it's 2 o'clock. Officially, we have finished the session. And yes, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a very big thank you from my side, from Social Work England. Thank you all presenters for a really insightful session. And we hope that all of you participants who are still in the meeting, you have enjoyed and find it helpful. Please be mindful the recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel, Social Work England YouTube channel, around end of April. And once again, if you haven't noted, in the chat, my colleagues have posted a feedback form. Please contribute and share your views, share your feedback with us, and also complete the survey, which is a new survey for social workers in England. Thank you, everyone, and thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of the day, and weekend is in sight. Thank you and goodbye.